Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
Well, let's have a listen to the Foreign Secretary, Jeremy Hunt, and what he has to say about the state of the negotiations.
Well, there is a particular situation in which you are just a matter of months, not years, but months away from being able to implement an agreement when it might potentially be helpful to have an option of an extension. But that doesn't resolve the substantive issue of principle where we still disagree with the EU, which is Theresa May has said we will not agree to anything that involves the carve-up of the United Kingdom, having customs borders within our sovereign territory, and nor will we agree to indefinite membership of the customs union.
John, what's he talking about?
That's a good question.
Does he know?
I think you've got to look at the words that are being used reasonably carefully. There is at the moment no policy of extending the implementation period. What there is an idea for an option of possibly extending the implementation period, an option which the Prime Minister is at pains to tell us will never be needed and will never actually happen. And what do you take from that? You take Brussels offering this possible idea. I think in their eyes, they're trying to be helpful. But anything that moves towards Brussels looks like a compromise, an accommodation of Brussels' point of view back at Westminster, and not just among hardline Brexiteers, is a compromise too far. So Theresa May is exactly in this hard place, walled in by the politics of Westminster and the Conservative Party too.
Is it a compromise too far, extending the implementation transition period?
Well, we don't know what the deal's going to be until we actually see the deal, and sure. I keep saying that to my colleagues.
But would it be a compromise too far?
The point you've got here, you've got a very distrustful atmosphere because ever since John started interviewing me when I came into Parliament 26 years ago, the history of the European issue is littered with assurances given by governments which have turned out to be untrue. And things that would not happen if we sign this or sign that then happen. And therefore, people are... You start talking about extending the implementation period, well, you're opening a can of worms. You're going into the new, what they call the financial perspective. And the European Union is saying, well, you'll have to carry on paying, you won't have a rebate, and then they might be able to pile in a whole lot of extra liabilities into the exit bill, which really, frankly, won't be worth paying for. Another 10 billion quid, another 15 billion quid. It won't be worth paying for that.
I mean, I think what's happening here is we're bumping up against a very clear reality that was not discussed during the referendum campaign. The issue of the Irish border, the issue of the fact that the EU's economy is 7 times the size of ours, so they, of course, have more power than us in these negotiations. But also, I think this is something the New Statesman's Stephen Bush has pointed out repeatedly, that the average trade deal takes 28 months to be negotiated. This period is 21 months. So, I mean, the idea that you would somehow cobble together a trade deal in these very, very unique circumstances where you're trying to actually have some distance from a trading partner, not get closer to it, is absolute fantasy land. I think that we need some reality in this, and the Conservatives have actually just been feeding us a ton of lies, and it's been entirely chaotic. People's lives, people's livelihoods are on the line here, and that is what we should be talking about.
How do you see it, Sarah?
I think that we are focusing too much on our side of it. I think the EU's intransigence has been extraordinary. They are treating us as though they are treating the British people who did vote to leave as though we were sort of criminals. And it's appalling. And as a result, it is, you know, they have an impossible task. Theresa May faces incredible obstacles and difficulties. You know, we've got...
But is that the EU's fault?
I mean, sorry, was it, you know, imitating her dancing? That's helpful, is it? I mean, the sort of stuff that we're seeing from them.
We can play silly games and talk about the little things.
There's no respect. They think that the most important thing for the EU is to make sure that this is a failure for Britain. Because if we get this right...
But there's no way it could be a success, Sarah.
You say that because you have your view. But, of course, there is a way that it can be a success. But it has to be... everyone has to work together, and they simply don't want that, because the problem is we have a EU where, you know, Italy wants to leave. Lots of, I mean, they're just worried. They're worried about letting go of their power, which is, you know, which is what drives them, and they are completely, determined,
Well,
and
let's
that's what we face.
Wind this back again, because there's a lot of talk about the transition period being sort of 18 months or being extended by another year, but we're not even close to getting there yet. First, we have to get a withdrawal agreement, and the withdrawal agreement is in two parts. The first part is the legal technical separation of the United Kingdom from the European Union. That consists of three major things: the protection of citizens' rights, EU citizens in the UK and UK citizens in the European Union. Secondly, the financial settlement of our financial obligations, which are currently down to about £39 billion. The dates we're going to pay it, what's the payment plan, what years we're going to pay, how much are we going to pay when. And the third thing is finding a solution to make sure there's permanently never a border, a legal piece of text that says we will never put a border back on the island of Ireland. We have to do those three things first before we can even get to the second piece, which is just a political declaration about we might have some kind of future trade deal, Canada plus, Norway, it might be EEA membership, or it might be a UK special relationship, and it probably will be, but not for 8 to 10 years.
All right, we've introduced you, Jason, but our viewers probably don't know exactly who you are. So let's show them a little bit from one of your podcasts.
Hello, and welcome to our first broadcast of Three Blokes in a Pub. I guess that's what we're going to call ourselves.
Drinking beer.
Drinking beer, obviously.
Hi, my name's Jason Hunter. I spent over a decade living and working in over a dozen different countries, inside and outside the European Union. I've negotiated billions of dollars of trade internationally, both within and without of the EU.
But just pick up, Jason, on what Sarah was saying. What about the intransigence of the EU and the way they have treated Theresa May? Does that not need some critical scrutiny?
Well, the EU is a rules-based organisation, the same as the World Trade Organisation is a rules-based organisation. Now, we know this because we helped write the rules over the last 40-odd years as members. So the European Union are bound by the Treaty of the European Union. They're bound by the Treaty for the Functioning of the European Union. They're also bound by other international treaties with another 60 countries around the world where they have other international trade agreements.
About their
Can I just
intransigence.
contest the basis of this? The EU obeys its own rules when it suits them. They didn't obey their own rules when the Eurozone
We are
was...
the EU,
just a minute,
we are
just
the
a minute,
EU.
I didn't interrupt you. They didn't obey their own rules when the Eurozone started collapsing, and they broke their no bailout rule. They started bailing out the economies that needed propping up. We told them the euro would be a disaster. We told them they would finish up bailing out. They assured us there would be no bailout.
And yet,
that turned out to be a lie.
And yet the euro.
And do you know what? The European Court of Justice...
the British pound at the moment.
The European
saying that
European Court of... The Eurozone will collapse. There is absolutely no question about it.
Another fantasy.
No, well, OK.
I mean, it might be your fantasy that the euro collapses, but it's a stronger currency than the British pound,
As we speak, the Italian banks are going through another liquidity crisis, and if they have... all the money in Germany would not be enough to bail out the Italian economy if they have a complete collapse.
Lucky they've got 27 other friends and neighbours who will help them out.
Oh, yes.
They won't have to go begging to the International Monetary Fund or to Vladimir Putin.
Thank God we're leaving, otherwise the bill will be landing on our doorstep.
Well, that's categorically not true either, because David Cameron
You said 27 other members.
David Cameron came back and he got a categorical piece of legislation that said we will not have to take part in any...
Is that like the no bailout clause that was in the Maastricht Treaty?
Can Britain get a good deal at this stage? I mean, is Theresa May right?
With whom?
Well,
we need a deal with the rest of the world because we're losing trade deals with 87 other countries.
Most countries trade with or without trade deals. Most trade happens without trade deals. Our biggest trading partner is the United States. We don't have a trade agreement with the United States.
See, that you don't know what you're talking about, Bernard. I'm sorry, I'm not having this.
Let Jason respond.
The European Union have dozens upon dozens upon dozens of cooperation agreements with the United States. The USA is our second biggest export market. They take 25% of everything we sell around the world.
So what are you saying, that trade's going to stop as soon as we leave the European Union with the United States? Is that what you're saying?
No, what happens is, with all of the countries, not just the United States, when we sell a widget today out of the UK to 87 countries around the world for £1, we'll be treated as a third country under WTO rules.
And, right? What does that mean for our trade, then?
What that means
you mean
is all of our
United States will stop buying our widgets?
No, it means all of our customer companies all around the world, whether it's South Korea, United States,
You won't
Canada,
actually say
Mexico.
what you're implying. Of course, trade will continue.
They will have to apply import
And we just had
tariffs.
Singapore on the radio this morning saying that they're doing a trade deal with the EU and they will novate their agreement to the United Kingdom when we leave.
All right, let me just open this up here. How likely do you think no deal is at this point? And are you worried about it?
I think it's unlikely. I think that they will bend over backwards to get something.
Right. And do you think people like Bernard Jenkin in the party should be in more compromising mode?
No, they can say what they think. It's up to them.
I mean, I do think that there is this some people seem to be living in this fantasy land where there's big talk and there's a lot of platitudes that we hear, aggressive platitudes, not only from the EU. We've also seen Theresa May making these big speeches about red lines that she then actually has to step away from. Actually, I think part of the problem is that the Conservatives have not been honest about the realities of these negotiations. At least with the Labour Party, what we have is them talking about the necessity of a customs union, and now we're seeing that actually that is the reality.
Manifesto.
I mean, but I think the point...
That wasn't in your manifesto.
But I think the point
I mean, if you want to
is
talk about opportunism, I think Jeremy Corbyn is pretty much top of the list.
I think that what is happening with Labour, I think what's actually happening with Labour is they've recognised where the country is. They've recognised the
they
reality of the
recognise an
referendum,
opportunity and they're pursuing it.
And they have had
if
their
he really
sixth
wanted
test,
to
which
get a
is
good
far
deal
more
for the
than what the
country, he would be
Conservatives...
helping the Prime Minister, not going up against her and making her life even
Can we
harder.
stop making this party
let Mike-
political? This is a national issue. This affects millions upon millions of households in the United Kingdom. When we were in Geneva, they said other countries around the world are back and forth to that same building we were in, and they are looking at the United Kingdom economy, saying which pieces can we take out of it. They said under every single model that they've run, with a withdrawal agreement, without a withdrawal agreement, with a transition, without, the agri-food sector in the United Kingdom has got 18 months to 2 years before other countries will decimate it. They will flood us with cheap imports.
John.
Real scaremongering.
There is clearly a possibility of the talks in Brussels ending up with no agreement and therefore no deal, although no one in Europe wants that to be the outcome, although a number of countries on the continent of Europe would see it as a dreadful outcome. Some of the lowland countries, Belgium and others, would suffer materially and seriously as a result of that. But it could yet happen. No one's even prepared for it. It's not quite that simple, as if that were simple. Were that to be the outcome, the thing then comes to Parliament, and there's no majority in Parliament for such an outcome. Although there may be no obvious mechanism for Parliament to give it the thumbs down and say you can't do this, Parliament will find a way when there is a will. So, we're heading into a fog, a deep fog, in which any outcome, however destructive, is still possible.
Right. I mean, Maya, on Jeremy Corbyn, do you think the Labour Party should be clear about its support for a people's vote?
I mean, I think that they're playing it as they have to, right? That these situations are all developing, and I think what they said at the party conference is we are going to observe what happens with these negotiations. It does depend on what happens with this deal, and I think the reason I make it party political is because it is the Conservatives who are in charge of these negotiations, and they are going catastrophically.
They are.
You're going obviously on the march. That is tomorrow, in fact, isn't it? The People's Vote March for a second referendum. What do you think of Maya's response in terms of Labour's position? Do you think they should be clearer?
I try and stay away from politics, but...
Best of luck with that.
You're in politics. Don't pretend that you're not...
Labour are playing a very genius...
Isn't a referendum a people's vote? I mean, what else is it? A goat's vote? I mean, who's voting if not people?
The Labour Party are playing a very clever political game, and it's strategy-wise, it looks great from the outside in business, because they're trying to be all things to all people. You can listen to...
But that's what opposition do.
Yeah, you can listen to... Len McCluskey, he'll tell you one thing. Jeremy Corbyn will tell you something else. Keir Starmer will tell you something else. John McDonnell will tell you a fourth different thing. So you can sit at home being a Labour Leave, a Labour Remain voter, and or you can all think that the Labour's the party for you. And they're not either. They're just not putting their money where their mouth is.
In all this rather febrile discussion, we tend to lose sight of the fact that Parliament handed the decision to the British people. The British people took a decision. And now the European Union is trying to keep this country prisoner. It's trying to hold this country hostage.
That's fear-mongering. That's Project Fear.
It's just a fact. They're trying to make sure. They're trying to make sure that leaving the European Union is as painful as possible.
Well,
if people like you win, it will be a defeat for democracy and a defeat for the British people.
Well, Bernard, take a look at the front page of the Evening Standard. It says Brexiteers need a vote, Remainers need a vote, we all need a vote, a people's vote.
Well, that's a Remain newspaper.
We've had a vote.
That's a Remain,
George Osborne,
Remain sporting. Yes, he was a Remain campaigning chancellor who lost the vote. We had the vote. When we had the vote, nobody said...
Based on lies, wasn't it?
But it is like voting California.
OK, how many lies did the Remain campaign?
OK, well, let me take this point.
Let me
how many lies did the Remain campaign
Well, what's Bernard asked first?
How many lies did the Remain campaign make?
What we're talking about is...
Well, what about the recession we're now meant to be in? The 600,000 unemployed we're now meant to have.
I will answer your question. David Cameron is accused of saying there'll be World War III immediately after the referendum. George Osborne is accused of saying we have to have an emergency budget immediately after the referendum. Vote Leave have been criminally prosecuted for overspending and breaking electoral law. Leave EU leaders
far less money than the Remain campaign.
And they didn't spend 9 million of...
sat in a parliamentary select committee and they said they gave evidence that they lied and they misled their voters. So what you're saying is everybody lied And yet you want to... you call that democracy? You don't believe in democracy. You just believe in Brexit. And that's not good enough.
I believe in democracy. In every general election, there are exaggerations which...
And lies.
It's what happens.
Let him respond.
And the people make up their minds. And the people have made up their minds. And you want to take on the British people. And that would be... if you really want to cause chaos.
I want to interject at this point because in terms of changing minds, Sarah, the Daily Mail has changed its tone, if not its mind, when it comes to some of its leader columns. If we look at this particular piece of commentary, it says, if transition lasts little as a few months more, is that not worth the wait? And after months of similar noises off, Mrs May's enemies risk resembling paper tigers. Have they moved into a better position away from hard Brexit in your mind, or have they betrayed readers?
I think that this is really about supporting Theresa May. I think this is about supporting the stability of the Conservative Party, because I think one of the whatever you say about how the negotiations have gone or the rights or wrongs of leaving, she's really up against a lot of obstacles, and I think the last thing we need now is for her to go. And I think she just needs to.
So you think the paper's in the right place? I mean, the resembling paper tigers, dare I say it, might be referring to purist Brexiteers like you, Bernard.
Well, actually, I agree with the first statement you read out, that if we have to wait a little longer to get the right deal, I think most of my colleagues would accept that.
So you would accept an extended transition then for
well, let's wait. That's why I say let's
just
wait
asking
and
in
see
theory,
until
yes.
we've seen the final deal.
But you would be prepared to wait a little bit longer?
If we have to wait a little bit longer to get what is a good deal, I don't think anybody could argue against
you're saying you didn't know what you voted for before, because we don't know what the final deal is. I know you get to have another vote on it when you know what it is, but we don't.
I campaigned and I voted for leave, and the country is leaving the European Union. You seem to be disputing that we can leave.
No,
you think unless the EU gives us permission, we can't leave.
Yes, Sarah said, you said your heart sinks.
But the heart does slightly sink at having more Brexit negotiations. I quite like it to end as quickly as possible.
Yeah.
I mean, I think there's a difference between wanting it to be extended and feeling that it needs to be extended.
Just listening to Bernard Jenkins, do you think number 10 will be warmed by the words of Bernard saying, actually, I'm relatively relaxed if it takes a few months more, go ahead and extend that transition period?
That wasn't permission to go ahead and extend the transition.
All right, but you know what I mean. You weren't violently against it.
Look, I think conditions are now such that anything that looks like a shred of encouragement is going to be grabbed, embraced and kissed to death by number 10 Downing Street. They are in need of... So you can look forward to that.
Yes,
this is a difficult spot. The word from number 10 is that everything is going in the right direction. They're making good progress. The party will be OK in the end. That sounds a great deal more like hope than the reality of where we are at the moment. We don't know. Anyone who tells you they know where we're going is simply giving you a lot of old baloney. We don't know. Who knows? It could conceivably work out. It is also possible that Theresa May will not be there long enough to see it not work out. I detect some mood on the backbench of the Conservative Party, which is a hardening of impatience against Theresa May. People who were previously tolerant and were seeing themselves as pragmatic are talking now about letters going in and all of that sort of thing. The atmospherics are getting much more troublesome.
Well, but you would win a vote of no confidence.
Well,
it would be a pointless exercise, because if you win a vote of no confidence, then you're there for another year. Is that right?
Well, you cannot be challenged.
You cannot be challenged for another year.
Yeah.
So actually,
on
that would consolidate
a substantial vote against her in a vote of confidence, even were she to win it, would still be seriously damaging.
Yeah, of course.
Now, this is not a dinner party, and more's the pity that there's no food yes, to eat here. But the broadcaster Esther Ranson, speaking on Chopper's Brexit podcast, I should say, made by Telegraph journalist Chris Hope. And here are her rules on Brexit being discussed at the dinner table.
You say you've seen your friends at each other's throats about Brexit. How do you police rows? Do you ban it at the table?
I do.
So when they walk in, you leave your coat, your hat and your Brexit views at the door.
I find them. I say, anyone who mentions the B word, you have to pay for the drinks.
Well, I'm not going to do that today, but it might come to that. Maya, is that a good idea, do you think?
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of people are really sick of these kind of ongoing negotiations and particularly the discourse around it. Like, the kind of arguments we've seen here, it's understandable, but I think people are really tiring of it. What they want to hear
We're all tired of it.
But what they want to hear is how their livelihoods are going to be protected, which is not, it does not seem to be part of the Tory plan at all right now. And I think people are concerned about their day-to-day, and the domestic agenda, as I mentioned, is non-existent.
Right, well, that concludes our discussion on Brexit for now. John, thanks very much.
A Brexit deal may never be reached, according to the European Union's chief negotiator. Michel Barnier says 90% of the deal is done, but that the problems surrounding the Irish border could collapse any agreement. And the Prime Minister is facing a fierce backlash against the idea of extending the UK's transition period after leaving the European Union. John Pienaar has this report.
Still in Brussels, still turning on the charm, or trying to, still getting nowhere fast. Not many more Leaders' Club photos like this before Britain leaves. But now Mrs May's been handed a set of politically impossible demands as the price of a deal. She went on her way with EU leaders like Donald Tusk, sympathetic but still leaving her to face mutinous Tories and angry unionists. Brussels' chief negotiator took to French radio to say Britain was behind its own problems.
Brexit
has numerous consequences. It was chosen by the British, he said. And at home today, the consequences included her Scottish secretary openly demanding no extension to EU fishing rules in Scotland.
What I want to be quite clear is that we're still leaving the common fisheries policy at the end of 2020.
So resistance to Brexit compromise on a possible extension has spread to Scotland. The Scottish Tories want Scottish fishing fleets free of EU rules and quotas. At Westminster, Tories on all sides hate the idea of extending the Brexit transition, with its further delay and further billions to the EU. They want the Prime Minister to mean it when she says she'd walk away with no deal.
It would help if the government started to demonstrate more confidence that we will leave if they can't get a deal. What we cannot possibly countenance is the idea that the European Union has to give us permission before we can leave.
But Mrs May's sticking to the hope she'll never need to lengthen the Brexit transition. Her aim's a trade deal without Britain having to stay under EU rules longer than planned. And if it does, she wants the UK free to pull out. Easy to say, hard to negotiate, and harder still to get past her party. Once supportive, or at least tolerant Tory MPs now say they're impatient, that a vote of confidence in Theresa May's leadership now looks more likely. And even if she survived that, she'd likely emerge damaged, politically weakened. There's also more muttering among Tories about the succession, who in the cabinet and who outside is manoeuvring for a future contest, and who Tory MPs want next. Brexit was always about high principles of sovereignty. It's coming down to the lower politics of power, plotting and political survival. John Pienaar, BBC News, Downing Street.
Conservative MP Johnny Mercer says he stands by his controversial comments that he could no longer vote for his party as he's not sure it shares his values. He hit out at the Tories arguing over Brexit and said if they let in Jeremy Corbyn, his party wouldn't be forgiven for a generation. It comes as Foreign Secretary Jeremy Hunt urged MPs to get behind the Prime Minister. Here's our political correspondent Paul Brand.
This morning was Theresa May allowing herself just a little Friday feeling. Relief that the week's out, but she's not. Finishing her meetings with EU leaders in Brussels, if she was looking relaxed, well, she's the only one. Unable to shake on a deal here, she'll now have her arm twisted back home, as the few still behind her keep pushing her on.
The strength of the EU in these negotiations is that all 27 countries have remained united throughout. We need to do the same, stand behind our Prime Minister so that she can get the best deal for Britain.
But fat chance of that when the Prime Minister faces MPs here on Monday. Officially, she'll update them on the progress, or lack of it, at this week's talks. But news has already reached them, and their reaction continues to make headlines of its own. Thank you. This Conservative MP's getting attention not for his new book, but for some page-turning quotes in a magazine. Talking about his own government, Johnny Mercer said, I mean, yeah, you realise it's a four-letter word, show. As for whether he'd vote Tory, he said, just being honest, I wouldn't vote. Of course I wouldn't, no.
I absolutely stand by it. I believe in a Conservative Party that shares the values and ethos of a modern Britain, and I have no self-interest in this. It's about the country. I believe the Conservative Party is clearly the party of government, and it's my job to speak out, I think, when I feel that's going awry.
Stop Brexit, stop inequality.
This weekend, tens of thousands of people will have their own say, joining a march to put pressure on the Prime Minister to hold another referendum. as she looks unlikely to win any other kind of vote.
There is no majority in Parliament for any particular alternative, and no Conservative MP I've spoken to wants a general election. So the only other option, the only other way of resolving this is by referring it back to the people. It's the get-out card, frankly, for the Conservative Party.
This evening, the Prime Minister's been calling businesses, hoping someone will back the plan she's negotiating. Theresa May's never really fitted in with the crowd, but abroad and at home, she needs to get it on side. Paul Brand, ITV News.
Now, Theresa May's beleaguered Brexit plan is facing yet more opposition from within her own ranks, this time from Scottish Conservatives, who've rejected any moves to delay Britain's departure from the Common Fisheries Policy. The Scottish Secretary, David Mundell, said the policy had been bad for Scotland and bad for the UK and had influenced many people to vote leave. Well, joining us now is the Conservative MP David Duckett, whose Bamford Buchan constituency is home to a substantial fishing industry. Welcome onto the programme. If there is an extended transition period which prevents you taking back control of those waters until 2021 or even beyond, would you vote against the deal in the Commons?
I would very much hope it doesn't come to that, because as I understand
If it does, though.
Right now, what we're expecting is to be sitting at the negotiating table as an independent coastal state in December, in the middle of December 2020.
And if that promise is taken away?
That's actually before the current implementation period plan is due to end. So if there is an extension, I would hope that very much that would still be the case. We'd still be an independent coastal state in December 2020.
But I mean, that would be cherry picking. The EU is absolutely allergic to cherry picking.
But the EU themselves has tried to cherry pick themselves. In the past, they've kind of mellowed on this position, but their initial position was that they would not allow any discussion on fishing at all unless they could have guaranteed access. So they were cherry picking fishing as an industry anyway.
But if that promise is taken away from you, just to repeat the question, would you vote against the deal in the Commons, along with the 12 other Conservative?
I would certainly, as I've said before, I've said in the Chamber, I've said publicly, I've been in the press as stating, I could not vote for any withdrawal agreement or fisheries bill that does not advance the interests of the Scottish fishermen.
And your 12 Scottish Conservative colleagues feel the same?
As far as I know, in fact, I know for sure, we are all of one voice on that.
So if Theresa May loses the support of the 13 of you, 13 whose votes she depends on, I mean, it's curtains for her, isn't it?
Well, like I said, I very much hope it doesn't come to that. And because we're talking with that one voice, and we're talking with that voice quite loudly.
You think she's listening?
I know she's listening.
How do you know that?
I was talking to the Prime Minister just last week on this very subject. Well, not so much on the extension, because we didn't know about it then, but talking about the interests of the Scottish fishermen. One other red line for us is that any access to EU vessels must not be tied to any trade agreement, for example. And
so what did she promise to you?
She's provided assurance time and time again, as has Michael Gove, the DEFRA Secretary, that this government's position is very much not to cross that red line.
Do you believe that promise, then? Because you've been promised before and it hasn't materialised.
Well, let me put it this way. I believe the promise, I trust the promise, but I'm not going to let up on holding the government to account on that either.
If you're still in the Common Fisheries Policy, by the time of the 2021 elections to the Scottish Parliament, could you look a fisherman in the eye and say, vote Conservative?
Technically, we will be out of the Common Fisheries Policy because we'll be out of the EU. The implementation period causes a complication because, as we understand it, the implementation period is due to end in December 2020. Now, I had to work with the fishing industry, fishing communities in my constituency to get them to swallow that. But that was based on the final deal of being an independent coastal state, having full sovereignty, having full control over who fishes in our waters, for what, when, and under which rules.
But if you're still in the Common Fisheries Policy, can you tell a fisherman to vote Conservative?
We won't be in the Common Fisheries Policy.
If you are?
We won't be.
I think I've got my answer. David Duckett, thanks very much for joining us.